when bad guys act like bad guys, okay, that's their nature. When Christians in the church start acting contrary to the way you expect them to, now it's more of a betrayal. Now it hurts more.
Welcome again to the Valor Vision Podcast. I'm Nick Ferloni, if this is your first time with us. And then on top of it, make sure to go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button and all of that, and then leave a comment after this, because you're going to definitely want to leave a comment after you hear this amazing story that we have from Eric coming here. But let me read a bio for our guest, Eric, and all that he's got going on. Eric Robinson recently retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, as many of us understand it, after a 24-year career as a special agent where he worked a wide range of investigations, including counterterrorism, crimes against children, white-collar crime, gang activity, drug trafficking, and public corruption. For 15 years, he served on the SWAT team as a SWAT operator, also worked as both a firearms instructor and tactical instructor as well, helping train law enforcement officers in high-risk operation and operational response. Eric also developed significant experience through his human intelligence teams, recruiting and managing confidential informants, and contributing to complex investigations in both national security and criminal cases. Two of the cases he worked on received an Attorney General's Award, one of the highest recognitions in federal law enforcement. Before joining the FBI, Eric spent 12 years in Christian ministry, including serving as a Baptist pastor in Western New York, with a background that gives him a unique perspective on human, moral, and spiritual challenges within law enforcement alongside the tactical and investigative side of the job. Eric is also preparing his first book coming out in the fall, if I'm correct, right? And the memoir that is sharing humorous, surprising, and fascinating moments of his career in ministry and in law enforcement together. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick.
So, dude, this is the unusual path. Usually it's I did the Army or I did police or something, and then that brought me to doing ministry, and then we go the other way around. But before we get into all of that, of like, man, your unique journey is, before we get into the pastor stuff and the FBI and SWAT and all of those cool guy stuff, who is Eric? Where did you come from? How was mom and dad? What was your childhood like? All of that kind of stuff that brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, I imagine your audience was tracking like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then you said pastor, and they were like, hey, what? Oh, okay. I got into ministry largely from my parents. We grew up in a Lutheran church in Northwest Ohio, medium size, small, and we went to church every week. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't like, yelling at the kids. It's just what we did. And so grew up in a strong home with a brother and a sister, and parents who, I don't know if this throws back to people who were involved in Marriage Encounter back in the 70s and 80s, which is just something to help couples learn to grow together. And I got to witness that, and I thought, okay, that all these things are normal. You go to church, you study the Bible. My dad was not very outgoing, but every morning he had a little Bible verse and devotional that he'd read to us. So I grew up not in a perfect home, but I have a hard time looking at any serious difficulties that we had. So I took that. I grew in my faith more in college. And then since I had a good understanding of the Bible and this seemed like the right thing to do, that's what drew me into ministry at a young age.
Kind of like that typical, well, this is where everything was leading already.
Yeah.
Might as well just dive into it. So now tell us, college, and then you just go into church planting automatically, or?
No, so it was a usual path of youth pastor and then associate pastor, but my wife and I had joined Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Cru, out of college. Difficult time raising money. It's tough to do, and you're begging people to give to you for that. Some family issues came up, so while we were in grad school, rather than going overseas as missionaries, which we had both been educated in to reach out to Muslim communities, I said, look, I don't know that we can do this. Let's look for a stateside position, and then youth pastor, associate pastor, And then my church in Western New York said, well, we'd like to plant a church off of us. And I said, that's great. I'd love to do that. Went through the process to be selected and training for that. And we started a church in Jamestown, New York that was meant to be an outreach to people who didn't normally go to church. We didn't want to just take the Christians from this one and now they can start giving to us over here. We look to draw on people who might not feel comfortable in a church. And with that, I gave my core group a flinch test to say, how are you at welcoming these types of people? What if somebody comes in and they're not dressed for church? You know, we're Baptists now. You got to wear a suit, but here's somebody who's coming in a concert t-shirt. Are you okay with that? What about piercings? What about tattoos? What about same-sex couples? What about interracial couples? Can you greet them, welcome them, and not have a flinch of, but, you know, you smell alcohol in their breath? Man, you smell alcohol in their breath? This is the best place for them to be on Sunday morning.
You know, you got some people that would flinch and other people go, I think that's Jack Daniels, right? Like they'd be able to
tell.
kind of figure it
Right.
out. You know, yeah, absolutely. I think that's very important. You know, I'm in ministry now, I'm the men's minister and the communications guy at my church and all of that. And I definitely see the differences of reactions when somebody walks in and, you know, we're not a suit and tie church, but still at least like, yeah, you're wearing like an AC/DC shirt and your jeans are all ripped up and you don't smell like you took a bath this morning, right? Kind of thing. And you still get people that are like, hey, I'm wearing at least a button down shirt and clean jeans, and they get like a little weird, you know, when that kind of walks in. And so what did you do to kind of work with, I mean, how did that flinch test go, you know, ultimately?
Well, I mean, I honestly did it on a piece of paper, and then before we planted the church, I said, let's talk through this. Let's talk about why that might be hard. And one of my favorite parables is when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven is like a man who finds a treasure in a field. It's an inestimable treasure. And you won't smell Jack Daniels on my breath. It's just hard to pronounce. But he finds his treasure and he sells everything he has to buy that field because he sees its value. And so I told the people, look, we're asking people to give up their way of life, everything they have, to follow something else. So we need to win an audience with them. We can't come in and off the rip say, this is where you're wrong and this is where you need to change. This is right and you've been mistaken the whole time. We need them to believe that we do have something that has great value. And the emphasis was, if we're going to make a mistake, let's err on the side of grace. So if God's going to judge us, you know, I want to make that mistake of like, oh, you guys were too kind or too loose. Maybe you should. But that I believed would be appealing to people who were staying out of church because they got the opposite. The results we got showed that this was something that people did want to see.
No, that's absolutely like a major, you know, understanding of people outside of the church is either it should be more welcoming or basically their idea is that it's not, you know, because of a bad experience and things like that.
Well,
But that brings a lot of pressure on you though.
It does. And in this, like, you know, if it were with you, Nick, like I may see things in your life that are going to destroy your life, but I can't address those with you until you believe in me and you trust me, you know I've got your best interest. What you brought up is true. That was a burden for me. And so the reason I had to leave ministry was when you start a church for people who don't go to church, they might have grown up in some bad circumstances. And so they brought a lot of life issues with them. And I found it impossible to separate myself from those issues. So it became a burden. And I went through a period where I had a stress related headache every single day because I couldn't let go of their stuff. So I told my wife, I got to find a job with less stress.
And I think a lot of people are probably thinking less stress. Wait, you listed off FBI, SWAT, you know, criminal investigations, dealing with like, you know, the worst of the worst that are going after kids, like all sorts of like stuff. And they're thinking you left ministry for that. Like how is ministry more stressful than all of what everyone else looks at and everything?
Yeah. And I say that as a joke, although it was true. But when I talk to people who work in the church, they go, yeah, I can see that. Because when bad guys act like bad guys, yeah, you're laughing because you know it. When bad guys act like bad guys, okay, that's their nature. When Christians in the church start acting contrary to the way you expect them to, now it's more of a betrayal. Now it's it hurts more. And so I've told many people that by my estimation and my beliefs, I'll spend eternity in heaven with some of the people I hate the most because they brothers and sisters hurt you. And I have no reason to question their salvation, but people can be petty. So between the hardships I had dealing with the congregation and their problems, and then some of the backstabbing that goes on in church, even in the best ones, it just became too much. And it was disappointing because I was doing church the way that I thought we should. And the results showed, yeah, this is necessary. People are being won to Christ, they're being discipled. But my body said, yeah, you can't do this anymore.
The beauty part is a lot of people would say, well, then you walked away from the body of Christ. And I would say, no, because like that doesn't add up to what scripture says. Scripture says that, we all are different parts of the body. We're supposed to do different parts of the body. And so this whole idea that I would say that you actually just transferred ministry to a different format and different capability. Now, we're about to say something. Go ahead.
Well, exactly. So you're getting it. It wasn't difficult for me to see what I was doing in the FBI as still doing God's work, because obviously you're doing God's work in the church, but God also wants justice for people, and the church can't bring that. The church can, if you're harmed, your child is abducted, whatever, you have a great financial loss, the church can step in, show support, maybe even raise money, but they can't bring justice. And that's something that God wants. I could still be doing that.
Yeah, no, I get it. But of course, that comes from my military background. I understand. I think a lot of other people sometimes would not. But how did that go? How did the transition from, okay, I realized ministry, stress, the way I operate, the way that God wired me as a person, these aren't lining up. And then, but wait, I'm going to do the FBI out of any, how did that thought process go to this transition to over there?
So I've met many fellow agents, and I say, oh, how'd you get in? And I have one good friend, Laura, who says, well, I studied this in college so I can get the FBI. And then I took this job, and then I became a federal air marshal as a stepping stone. How did you do it? And I said, oh, I thought the FBI would be cool. So like on a whim, I applied. And I mean, because it is. The FBI is cool. And here's all these people, like, when I was a child, I met a police officer and I thought, I want to be that someday. And for me, it was I have to do something different. I had a background in writing, so I applied to some trade magazine and they rejected me. And I'm like, I'm overqualified. And I applied to the FBI and I thought, why not? I've asked girls out of my league. So, and they came back and they said, yeah, how about a second round? And I go, okay. And the cue to me that I had done the right thing was the day I got accepted into the FBI, headache stopped, because I knew I didn't have to carry this stuff anymore. I had something new to move on to.
Did you almost feel like there was a greater sense of purpose for you in jumping this direction compared to ministry, as we see traditional ministry done as being a pastor?
It was difficult. I did not at the time because I was still fairly young. I was 32, 33 when I joined the FBI. And I thought, I'm going to do ministry till I'm 80 because you can do that. As we talked previous, guys go from, hey, I'm 65 and retiring, I'm going to go work in ministry. That's the usual transition. It's an old man's job. But I'd start out young, and I thought it would be a noble thing to do to be in the FBI. But I really, the reason I hung on so long despite the headaches was because this seemed right. I'm built for this. Otherwise, I do it well, and now I have to abandon it. And coming to that conclusion took far too long.
I can just, because I just know that was a on the reverse end. It was a transitional shift that was difficult, was leaving the military side and then going. I mean, I knew leaving was the right time for me, but what's the sense of purpose, continue on, because purpose is such a big thing, not just for anybody, but for men, really specifically. And so, I can just see like, man, this is such a different dynamic on a traditional scale. But yeah, there's got to be like, when did purpose like really kind of jump at you at the FBI going, man, nope, this is it?
Well, the initial feeling is, my gosh, they want me for this too. And so I started out in awe of that's amazing. I get to work with the FBI. It's a premier law enforcement agency in the world. That's remarkable. And so it began with that. And then there's the fire hose of understanding what the FBI is about and how it works. After I'm like in awe, then I'm like, oh crap, that's a lot. And piece by piece in the academy, you learn how to put the investigations together, but most of it took place in the field where you're just thrown in and now you're jumping in to assist and doing your part until you can take on your own cases. But it was pretty early on that, just the being part of something so historic. I felt that before. There's plenty of times while I was in the FBI, I was there for 24 years, where I would purposefully sit back and just look and go, this is awesome. I get to do this.
I'm sure you've got tons of stories.
Yeah.
What's kind of like jumping out at you like right now? Like, man, what are some of the stories, man, that not only, hey, this is a cool story, but also, you're coming out of ministry. Where did you use your faith also in some of the events that you find yourself in now?
Yeah, I used skills that I used in ministry. I don't know if it's what I learned. I'm sure a lot of it was. Some of it was just who I was, and that's why I got into ministry.
Mhm.
Coming to people with openness and curiosity. If I come to you as a pastor and you say you've got a problem and I just give you the Bible verses that here's the answers without being curious about what's going on in your life, not listening first. There's all the databases and legal forms, subpoenas, search warrants that we can use in an investigation, but eventually an agent has to interact with people, and that's where you're going to succeed. So as far as something that sticks out, maybe for your audience too, and this is a bit of a shocking tale, I worked crimes against children for a number of years, but after I'd gotten out, a buddy of mine named Alex was working in the task force. He was leading it, still does, and he had a case on pastors in the Toledo, Ohio area where one young girl was being pimped out by her pastor foster father, and she was being trafficked to other pastors. And so probably because I had that background, Alex had asked me, can you interview one of the subjects, one of the guys who had engaged with the teenage girl? And so, we come to his house, we clear it, sit down, people are working the search warrant, and I had prepared a very literal come to Jesus message for him. And I had Bible verses ready about confessing your sins and being honest before God. And I started into that, and I had the evidence too. But as I started into that, pretty quickly, he put up his hand. He said, hey, man, I'll talk to you, but we're not going to bring Jesus into this. And it became very evident that he had bifurcated his life. So here's the man who stands up in front of the crowd and preaches Jesus on Sundays, meets with people, counsels them. And here's the man who was leading a sinful life, doing things that most of society would say is disgusting. And he was willing to address that, but because that is how he separated and compartmentalized himself, even in this moment, that was something that he wanted to do as well. Keep Jesus out of this. We'll just talk about how I broke the law. You're wrapping your head around that one.
That's pretty shocking. That's pretty wild. How did that end up? I mean, I take it he's serving some time.
How that ended up was while we were waiting trial, the young girl was kidnapped by her pimp foster father's wife and daughter. So like her half sister and half mother. She was kidnapped and forced to recant her story, thinking that would, despite all the evidence, that would get the pastor off. She escaped, and we ended up doing a series of interviews. When they went to trial, she testified, and the pastor that I had interviewed was offered, I think, a 12-year plea deal. And his attorney laughed and said, we'll take our chances. And he got life in prison, which is very rare.
Thank God.
Yeah, he did not take responsibility for his actions in court. The judge didn't like that and gave him all that he could. And the great part of this too is that young girl, this was probably 10 years ago, maybe more. I was talking about her to our victim coordinator, counting these details, and she said, oh, let me show you a picture. She's got a little boy now. She works in the government, and she'll often come by and tell about how the FBI rescued her and saved her life from this. So it ended up being, we do what we do because we're supposed to. But here on the tail end, I got to hear the good results of how she had overcome some of the trauma that she'd been through.
Yeah, no, praise God. I mean, And I think that, of course, those are stories that in our human flesh that rocks the church world, because then it just adds to the question of church and its validity and everything. But, honestly, unfortunately, it just proves even more so that nobody escapes the ugliness that is out there in the world. It's there. We're going to live through it. And we are all desperately in need of a savior,
Yeah, this is one
even those that preach his name.
yeah, you can't even call it hypocritical. It's beyond hypocritical. Hypocritical is, very simple. This was beyond what most people would do.
Yeah. No, as a father of a young girl, that it's kind of sickening to sit here and hear that. But I mean, we're seeing more and more of this also with the files that are dropped, Epstein, all that kind of stuff, and everything. And it's just the ugliness of the reality of life. It's not like I haven't seen ugliness before through my deployments and things like that. And so we're both on the same page. It's like, hey, the world is a lot more vile than some people want to understand that it can be. Again, we are all desperately in need of a savior because we can't save ourselves.
Well, and I worked with people who were, when I was a pastor, who would admit to that or say, I'm struggling. I've got a drug addiction, or, I've been cheating on my
Yeah.
wife. But then they're trying to work with you on that. And this is like that next level of filth. And it's people who've been trying to hide it the whole time. So that was eye opening to me to be in law enforcement. And, now you're starting to see, well, both the literal filth as we do search warrants in the houses, but also just the moral filth. And I had to take time to remind myself, not everybody's like this. You spend your day looking at criminals, so don't watch your heart, because you can get very cynical when all that you see are terrible people and think everyone's terrible.
Yeah, no, that's a huge thing now. Just we talked, recently sworn in also as a volunteer police chaplain for my county and stuff, and a lot of the statistics that police officers deal with, just you're on a magnifying glass of like the scum of the earth, basically.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the primary subject of who you're dealing with. You don't deal with the decent mom and dad that take their kids to Chuck E. Cheese and everything's okay. And, there may be like, scuffles at home, but it's not like domestic violence and like massive issues. You're not dealing with that general public. You're dealing with the smallest. And so protecting your heart, guarding your heart through all of that, and also the guys and ladies around you in, the FBI, and this goes for any police officer that's in other, what were some personal methods that you use to kind of really help reel yourself in to realize, hey, this line of work takes some grit, if you will.
Yeah. So my first 5 years in the FBI, I worked Mexican and Colombian drug cartels in Chicago. And so every Mexican I interacted with was either dealing drugs, helping to deal drugs, assisting the drug dealers, even if they weren't being criminal, driving them, acknowledging and supporting it. And so I had a buddy who had similar beliefs as me, and I would talk to him about it and say, hey, man, we got to be careful, because this causes a racial bias where all the Mexicans I meet are either criminal or accepting of it. And I don't want to universalize that, and then I was doing jujitsu at the time, and I meet, a guy I'm rolling with named Francisco, and he's like, hey, he was a great guy. He's like, hey, just so you know, Eric, I'm not here legally. And I'm like, okay, but you're a great guy. And he's like, yeah, I'm a plumber. I work as an apprentice. And so it helped to have that contact with people like you. I know not everyone is like this, but I have to interact with some people who are not like that and are decent people to have the evidence for myself of like, yeah, they're not all so bad. And even with the criminals, we'd be chasing these guys and we'd arrest them. And there's two types of criminals. There's guys who break the law, and then there's guys who break the law and are horrible human beings too. And some of these guys we'd arrest, there's this guy who, like, he was dealing in, 10, 20 kilograms of cocaine a month in Chicago. We arrest him. Hey, he was so nice. And, my partner's like, I'd be fine living next to this guy. Like, he was very respectful. He just, like, I broke the law, and now you do what you do and I'll do what I have to do. But he was a sweet guy. So there's those guys, and there's the ones where they beat their wives and they're just greedy and sociopathic, and you're like, okay, well, you broke the law and you're terrible too.
And there's the scale of the slippery slope where some people they find themselves due to situations in life that they make a bad decision, even though they're generally, like you said, the guy that you would have no problem being your next door neighbor. But life situations, for all we know, that guy could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And the only way for him to get out of it was, well, here's an opportunity to sell some coke, or do whatever. But he's a nice guy, but guess what? He's doing that not to make it right, but it's to show the idea that people make bad decisions sometimes.
They do. And in his case, I think from his culture, it was amoral. It wasn't, he knew it was against the law, but it wasn't morally wrong. And we would have the same when we would arrest teenage prostitutes, trying to rescue them, and some of the adult prostitutes. Like, what they're doing is filthy, but it's also for survival because they're in a bad place. You don't think they would want to like work at Amazon for a better wage? You don't think they'd want to be a supervisor there as opposed to meeting men they've never known who are filthy and lewd? Of course they would. But they were placed in that situation through whatever events. And then you meet the pimps who come from a culture that says this shows you're a true man and in control when you have these women and you treat them poorly and you have them in their place and you make money off of them too. So, that you feel bad for the women and then you feel disgusted by the men so much more.
Yeah, you just kind of really see the what's the root of it. I think it's not to ever excuse the sin, right? But I think it's a level of having the compassion of understanding the slope of humanity that falls into some of these things at times. Though it's not a decision, a lot of us probably sitting here watching this podcast, what do you mean? There's terrible decisions. Why would you do that? And it's like, well, some of these people they weren't raised and they weren't put into an opportunity that a lot of us being able to sit here and watch were born into or had or were afforded. And again, it doesn't excuse it, but it allows us to like, hey, let's take it at a human approach. And did you ever like I'm sure like that girl that unfortunately is dealing with, being, sex trafficked as a young girl, you said that she reaches back out and she kind of lets you know where she's at in life. And, kind of in a way you get to minister to some of these either victims or even some of the criminals that kind of go, man, I never really wanted to have this life, but this is unfortunately where I'm at.
And I tried to take the approach exactly as you said, even with the criminals, because I can be bad cop easy. It it's much more fun. It's much more fun to just push you around and start swearing at you. But I never regretted coming with some compassion. And again, if I offer you compassion and you say go screw yourself, like, okay, well then that's now we'll move on to this.
Time to
But
be bad cop.
right. But showing treating them with humanity. Many times the criminals respected the FBI. They respected me. They usually had run-ins with law enforcement because, like you say, FBI is different. I'm sitting in an office most days, and then I go out and we do an arrest. Whereas cops, one after another, they're just getting bad calls. And so, these gang members or the pimps were acting poorly at first. I can sit by that, but that's their interaction with the police. And the girls we would go after, they didn't trust us at first until we could show them repeatedly we're on their side, we're trying to help them. But yeah, coming to the criminals, even with that compassion and listening, like if you want to lie to me, I'll listen to you lie to me because I'm going to understand you better. I'm going to understand where you're coming from. And from that, like I would have the pimps argue because we're hitting them with a sex trafficking charge, which is a lot of time in prison. And they'd say, yeah, but she was already prostituting. Like she was already out there doing this. I just, helped her out. She's actually doing better under me. That's great. That's great for me to hear that. Now I know your mindset. Now I know why you look at this and you don't think it's bad because you didn't drag her off the street, throw her in her van, start giving her heroin. She was already taking heroin. She was already prostituting. And you're like, you're actually getting her to make more money. It's just that you're a horrible human being because rather than help, you are benefiting off of her having sex with strangers.
You're enabling it. and for profit.
Promoting.
Yep. Now, okay, so you said you dealt with the cartel and all of these, and I mean, really any serious criminal entities like that, there's a lot of risk and danger in there. And I've personally known some people that have dealt with that, and they get so entrenched in it that actually their lives and their families' lives actually can be in danger. Have you ever had like issues like that where there's a warrant, almost like in a reverse way, like the cartel has a warrant out for you or has a bounty out for you in a way?
Well, in Chicago, I was fortunate because we would have to prove that this individual who's selling large amounts of cocaine has a tie to a certain drug cartel. And then so we would through phone records. And by the time we'd arrest them, they go like, I don't know what cartel I belong to. I just get them from Kevin, who's like, gets it from Miguel in El Paso. But as I was working in Ohio, I had a couple of cases. One was on a guy who I wasn't afraid of, but you never know what guys can do. I had a long-term financial investigation into him, and he had stolen, I estimated, $22 million from people in the Toledo, Ohio area. And then he blew it all. And so his wife divorced him. He got remarried. 2 months later, the second wife divorced him. And so he moved into his sister's house that was in my neighborhood. And so Halloween comes and I have to, walk the kids around for trick or treat, and I'm packing, but I also put on a gorilla mask because I don't want him to see my kids. And so, he had threatened to kill me, but he was more afraid of me than I was of him. And yet you never know. And then there was another kid that I had done a quick case on who was likely to become a mass shooter. By the time we arrested him and executed a search warrant at his house, his father thanked us for this because he knew he couldn't control his son and he had the same fears. He'd actually hidden some of the guns that his son had bought, and we found those that were hidden. And he came out of prison and would send menacing emails and letters to the FBI. And his counselor said that he worked with death row inmates, but this kid scared him more than anybody else that he'd been with. And so every time I parked my vehicle for the last remaining years in the FBI, whenever I parked in the garage, I would stop and I would look around first before I got my stuff because I didn't know when he might pop out.
Yeah. I mean, so, oh my gosh, that there's almost like a level of like, I think those stories alone probably ward off a lot of people of jumping into professions like this as it is. But again, it's part of that feeling of calling and duty and everything else and purpose, right? Um, Now, again, coming from a pastor to this, being on a SWAT team, working with other guys in the FBI, all of that, when people learn of other people's past, like that kind of adds a label, right? When I was in the military and we knew one of the guys came out of being a chef for a while, it was like, bro, you're making the food. And so being a pastor, it's like, were you kind of like almost like the internal chaplain or the internal pastor in a way to some guys, or
Yeah, a bit. So in the academy, they gave me the nickname Preacher, and I tell folks I went from preacher to breacher because I broke down the doors for our SWAT team.
Yeah.
And there were some guys along the way. There was one buddy in Chicago who I would pray with if we were together before an operation just for safety. And there were people who came to me. I headed up the employee assistance program in Chicago for 5 years before I got onto the SWAT team, figuring, well, that's natural. But it's difficult because you're limited in what you can do. I mean, it really was like a chaplain because people would just come and unload, and I didn't have a solution, but I'm just going to listen.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And yeah, being a chaplain is very different. A lot of people don't understand. But like, if you're actually a chaplain, you're not there to evangelize for your faith, but you're there to help, and if they open up the questioning about faith, then it's like, okay, game on. Like, here we go. Yeah. Any other stories before I wanted to start diving into like what brought you into getting out and then writing a book, but any other stories that you're just like, man, you guys got to hear this one.
So we had this investigation into a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement, which caused some problems because this was around 2020, and it all began when a buddy of mine asked me to come on over and help him because there was a leader in the Toledo area who was threatening him and his family. They had wrongly reported online that my friend had abused one of their foster kids, and this guy who was an internet warrior was going to send all of his followers over to my buddy's house to attack them. So I spent that night with my rifle sitting in his driveway, making sure they were safe and everybody was fine. But we opened up an investigation into this guy who was a leader in BLM, and he was a black man, but he happened to be an albino as well, which made for a strange combination. And so we sent out our subpoenas after weeks of looking into his works and what he was doing. And we found that he was raising money for Black Lives Matter, but it was going straight for himself. And so, though we had all these harassment charges and these threats against him, we ended up charging him with wire fraud and money laundering because he had gotten over $400,000 from people because he had set up an account to receive these donations in the name of Black Lives Matter of Greater Atlanta, except that he was in Toledo. So Atlanta is like a hotbed for civil rights issues. And so people would have a birthday and like, hey, Nick, in honor to you, instead of giving you money, I'm going to give dollars to Black Lives Matter of Greater Atlanta. And this guy was buying rifles and steak and a 4-post bed. He was also buying a prostitute, and he bought a house with this money. So with all of this, we finally got him charged. But this fellow was, I think our intel analyst ended up losing his mind by watching this guy's videos because he was so full of himself, thinking that he was a civil rights leader and pushing himself that way, but also at the same time was a very big hypocrite as well. So we ended up charging him and just went through the harassment of trying to get him put away while he was still out on the street and harming people. I think he ended up getting 4 years for that. But it was a crazy story that here was an albino black man raising money for Black Lives Matter. And then along the line, this fellow whose name was, he gave himself a name, he changed it, of Sir Major Page. He changed his name to Sir Major. He was actually the nephew of Alan Page, who was a justice for the Minnesota Supreme Court as well as an NFL Hall of Famer. So just a crazy amount of things along the way, and I did not mind at all breaking down his door.
Because there's just a level of, I think that also aggravates me, is where people take, civil rights causes that can be good causes and religious causes and all of these kinds of things, and then just absolutely twist it for their own greed. And yeah, and I'm sorry, you know what you're doing. And yeah, kicking in their door, I would love to have been there and been a part of that, kind of deal.
Well, and then my buddy who was threatened at the beginning, and he was the reason we initiated the investigation into the harassment of him. And then this guy had harassed and threatened many others. So I have a tradition, or I had one, that when I would break in a door, I would save the plate from the door. Like that was my own thing. And so I gave it to my buddy after I had done this, and like, hey, make something nice out of it, like a Christmas ornament or something like that, because he was the one who kicked this all off.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, but again, it's still more of the don't lose heart in the goodness of people, but also just have a little weariness of what you're doing and where because to the general people that want to give to purposes they believe in and things like that, and then you hear of cases like that, and you're like, then I'm just gonna not care about giving money to anybody then.
Yeah.
And it can make a lot of people cynical when you hear stuff like that.
Well, and this guy, if you met him in person, you knew he was a shyster, he was a scam, but all his money came just from a Facebook page, and it was, $50 at a time. So it was many, many people, giving like, hey, I'm going to do a fundraiser. Let's see if I can raise $1,000 for BLM of Greater Atlanta. And so 20 people give $50 and it goes on the way. But yeah, those people didn't meet him. They were just, like to support a cause.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those, hey, make sure your money's going to an official site, an official location for whatever. Don't just willy-nilly give it to any old person that uses a name for their own personal things. So
yeah, on
be
Facebook.
wary out there, people. So, man. So now you're So you're in the process of retiring right now, or you have retired officially?
Well, I wouldn't be on here if I hadn't retired because
Okay.
the Bureau frowns on sitting down and telling stories of cases.
Yeah. And so you got a book coming out. Again, that's also something I remember you telling me about. That had to get a little bit of proofreading more than other books because of the line of work that you've been doing and what a lot of stories are going to be in there.
Yeah, it's in the FBI's hands right now. There's a process where they have to check it, make sure I'm not sharing state secrets or embarrassing the FBI, but I embarrass myself more than I do them.
That always makes for good humor right there. And so that's coming out in the fall if everything lines up time-wise, right? Do you have a title for that already?
I do. It's called Irreverent because I was a reverend and I did a few irreverent things along the way. So it's called Irreverent, from saving souls to chasing sinners in the FBI.
That sounds really good, man. I'm excited for this book to come out. Definitely put me on the wait list for this one.
You'll be on it.
It's going to be a good one. So, bro, really good to have you on. And so we're going to have all of your, where anybody can get a hold of you, all like the links and all that kind of stuff on there. And then I know you're working on kind of like the official wait list for the book and stuff like that. And so I will update this once we have all of that as well. Come back and check the descriptions and all those kinds of things. Or we just may have to have you back on, come close to launch date for all of that and see how things are going, and
Absolutely.
kind of do another one. But man, it's these are we could, if we're on the phone, we're going to be on the phone forever talking about all sorts of fun stories because
Absolutely.
that's what warriors do. We talk about war stories all the time in different contexts. But man, thank you so much for being on. Thank you for all of what you have done. And again, it is truly ministry in just a different context of how you transferred your life and doing good work and to, bring justice where it's needed. And then ultimately, I think for all of us out there, definitely those of us of faith, realize that even though it's looks like some people get away with stuff, ultimately God will always have the full amount of justice in the end. And I hold dear to that in my faith as well. And I know you do too. And so, but thank you, Eric, for being a part of the show. And so that's going to wrap it up for us here at Valor and Vision, guys. But don't forget to make sure to have valor, courage in the face of adversity, so we can go after the vision that God has for us in our lives. Take care. God bless.